This week, what we'll be doing is building on our understanding of Iranian history and how we got to the point where they've become what they have in their threats to the region, threats to the international community. And let's be blunt, it is a very malign influence in the world. Well, how did that happen? Starting from the Iranian Revolution and then moving through into the experience of the Iran-Iraq War, and the post-war expansion that Iran experienced, then looking at the entire regime of diplomacy through terror and force that they've created, and then the concerning element of their nuclear ambitions. So when we look at the Iranian Revolution and its immediate aftermath, we're talking about this period of the couple of years from 1978 to 1980. It's important to again reflect on the causes of that revolution. So the discontent that had built up over the Shah's authoritarian rule, which led to calls for change and reform, and then some elements of those calls actually were not particularly fascist or Islamofascist or hardcore. It was there was a mix of feelings, but certainly as we tracked the role and rise of the ulama, the clergy in Iran, made them a significant element to all of this in the leadership of the movement for change and for the revolution. And so the role of Savak was increasingly intensified during this rise of discontent, and the repression was commensurate with the levels of discontent, but also fed into it. So at that time too, you started to see some economic hardship feeding the discontent. Inflation and unemployment contributed to the unrest, and then you start to see the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini as a central pivotal focus point, the man on the white horse, if you like to describe it that way, who's going to inspire the masses and come in and be the lightning rod for change. And so you can see economically what that looks like at the period that the revolution happens, and how foreign investment drops off a cliff at this point at the time of the revolution, and so you can see how that was feeding into discontent, and income per head, also per capita, really dropped off significantly. So there were a couple of events that became catalysts for the physical revolution. So in 1978, in August, you had the deaths of about 400 people at the Cinema Rex fire, which was due to arson by Islamic militants, and it was claimed by the opposition as having been orchestrated by Savak, but that wasn't the case. At one time when Savak didn't actually deserve the accusation. So the popular revolutionary movements across Iran and large-scale strikes and demonstrations started to paralyse the country for the remainder of that year. And then on the 16th of January 1979, Pahlavi goes into exile as the last Iranian monarch, the end of all that millennia of imperial rules of various shades that we looked at, leaving his duties to a regency council and Shapur Bakhtiar, the opposition-based prime minister. So on the 1st of February 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns from France, where he's been in exile, followed by an invitation by the interim government that had been established to become their leader, or the leader of the movement. And several million people greeted Ayatollah Khomeini as he arrived back in Iran and landed in Tehran. So at this point, everybody's parking any issues they might have about what the future is going to hold, but really focusing their attention on the change that's ahead of them through the figurehead of Ayatollah Khomeini. And so by the 11th of February, the monarchy is brought down and Khomeini has assumed leadership. And at the same time, you see guerrillas and rebel troops overwhelming the Pahlavi loyalists in literal actual armed combat. And then you start to see the stepping stones by which we become the theocratic autocratic state that it was to become. In March 1979, the first step being a referendum in which 98% approved the shift to an Islamic Republic. And so this reflects too what we talked about earlier about the rejection of foreign interference, the wanting to reinforce and uphold Iranian culture and the rise of the strength and domination of the Twelver Shi'ism religion in Iran, and their ambitions to be the leadership of the Shia movement. So that feeds into the acceptance of this being an Islamic Republic, described formally and officially as such. And they start then drafting a new constitution, and Khomeini emerged as the supreme leader of Iran in December 1979. So what were the key themes of this Islamic Republic? Well, their international policy centered on the theme of anti-Western influence of all kinds, just a rejection of Western culture, Western standards, Western attitudes. And in particular, many will recall the labeling of the United States as the Great Satan, and that's kind of reflective of the fact of the CIA involvement in the coup in 1953 that unseated the Iranian Prime Minister in the face of the nationalisation of the oil industry. And then another element of their foreign policy became the destruction of Israel, the Zionist entity, as a significant priority for their regional focus and a core objective. So it was these twin evils of the United States and Israel became the focus of their foreign policy, and expressed in extreme terms. So this wasn't, anything to do with supporting Palestinians at this time, or it was really just about destroying the state of Israel and presumably all of the Jewish residents of Israel at the same time. So along with this, they set the ambition to lead the global Islamic revival and pay lip service to unity between Shia and the Sunnis, and downplaying traditional Shia sectarian issues. So, really by focusing too on the demonization, delegitimization of Israel and the threats to destroy it, was largely about establishing your leadership in the Islamic world and surmounting these sectarian differences. We could all unite around Israel. And so in many ways, funnily, if Israel didn't exist, you might have had to invent it to create unity in the Middle East and Islamic world, as far as the religious aspect of Islam is concerned. And it is interesting too that we hadn't really embarked upon an Islamist extremist world at this point, and it was the increasing extremism and fundamentalism of the regime in Iran that I think started to promote harkening back to the days of the Caliphate and to a tradition building of really trying to force a more extreme interpretation of Islam on the global Islamic community. And Iran certainly wanted to take advantage of that to build its influence in the world and its hegemony in the region and its leadership. So it started to export, or look to export, the revolution and Khomeinist doctrines of their very strict fundamental interpretations of Islam. And, this was no doubt or obviously going to come at the expense of the Sunni leaders in the region, of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, etc. And so there was a lot of concern starts to be evident amongst those countries and their leaderships. Of course, at the time too, you see the final destruction of what might have evolved as a democracy of the Majlis became subject to the Guardian Council, which was the vehicle by which religious control of the democracy, who could compete, who could be elected, and in fact, complete dominance of the processes in Iran. So then that leads into the Iran-Iraq war, which happens obviously very early in the regime, and the war lasts from 1980 to 1988. So 8 years of war between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. And, it points, it sort of looked a little bit like a death spiral, existentialist sort of attritionist approach to warfare, where, we're descending back into the days of trench warfare in many ways. And it's important to understand where Iran is now. A lot of that grew out of the Iran-Iraq war. I think from the Iraqi perspective, Saddam Hussein was looking to take advantage of the fact that they'd just come out of a revolution, that they were going to be militarily weak, because a lot of the weaponry, the ordnance, the systems that Iran possessed at the time had come from the West. And so the West was immediately going to stop supporting those systems and assets. And so, Saddam Hussein really thought, right, this is a really great opportunity. They're fractured, they're recovering from a revolution, and they won't have the military capacity to resist me. Whereas Saddam Hussein is drawing on these vast resources of weaponry that he's acquired from the Soviet Union. So this massively lengthy conflict of 8 years gets underway. And, this is fed, the human cost is fed by the Iranian approach, which is like, okay, if we don't have a whole bunch of tanks and aircraft, etc., well, we'll just send human waves at the Iraqis. And so this was the beginning of a bit of a cult of martyrdom that hasn't really faded in Iran, and in fact actually was adopted in many other circumstances by terrorist and fundamentalist movements in the region. But resulting in mass casualties, and quite often children were used to go out and clear minefields, etc. And you'd see back in Iran these fountains running red. We died to give the impression that these are fountains of blood and all this sort of stuff. So it's beginning to celebrate the culture of death and martyrdom. So the end result of this war was one that didn't settle issues between Iran and Iraq at all, but it also led to, the beginning of the rise of a concern about the sectarian nature of these conflicts, and the ethnic, in fact, as well, because Iranians are not Arab. So you've got that mixed ethnic heritage that we talked about through the history, separate from the rest of the region and the Arabic cultures. So the fault lines are being drawn here and carved and then, dyed in blood. And then out of that, what does Iran learn? So they built a dependence on their guerrilla tactics and to engage in combat against larger conventional forces. And how do you do that? What we would label as asymmetric warfare. And, the sorts of tactics they used, for example, in the marsh areas around Basra to do outmaneuvering processes around Iraqi defences. And these included creative solutions like the use of speedboats, etc. And that would start to be reflected too in relation to the so-called bog hammer fleets that they built up to challenge Western military presence in the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, to perhaps use that as a pressure point in the impact that they could have in shutting down those waterways and the oil traffic. So all of these asymmetric concepts start to be built on and evolved into how they're going to approach their relationships in the region and pursue their strategic ambitions. And then, they obviously said, okay, well, we've got to start investing in what we can do ourselves in military technology, and then look to other sources that are not Western to how we equip ourselves. So the war created this lasting legacy of instability in the Middle East and affected regional security for years to come. So some of the impacts, like I myself met the Mujahideen-e-Khalq that were people who'd fled the impacts of the regime in Iran and were being organised and exploited by Saddam Hussein in Iraq to conduct attacks across the border into Iran. A very interesting group, because they would do anything to offend the Iranian attitude to issues. So, for example, they made a very studied habit of having female leadership of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, and obviously a great insult to Iran. But really interesting group in many ways, and they created quite a conundrum when the coalition forces entered Iraq and overrun Iraq in 2003 as to what the hell you were going to do with the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, and nobody actually had a good idea for quite some time. So these power dynamics also reshaped in the region as a result of this, a bit of a weakening of Iraq, and Iraq then starts turning its focus south to Kuwait, as we know how that would play out only a few years later. And then the US foreign policy starts to kick in as well, in terms of the decisions and the approach they have in subsequent years. and it's also reflected in the way they dealt with Iran in terms of sanctions, etc. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So then we'll look at this reconstruction period that Iran goes into through 1989 to 2000. And, a lot of damage to infrastructure through this period. It really affected many things, including Iran's ability to produce oil. And the impact of sanctions starts to really bite here, because you have two phases of sanctions: the period between 79 and 81 in the immediate post-revolution phase, where you had the US in particular leading the charge there in the wake of the hostage crisis that existed there. And up until that point and till today, until a little earlier this year, that hostage crisis was the longest historical hostage crisis in the modern history of terrorism, only been overtaken now by the situation of the Israeli hostages in the Gaza Strip, which is now approaching the 600-day mark. So those economic sanctions throughout that period then get built upon. There was a relaxing of them for a period of time, for 6 years, when there was a hope to build a relationship and get on a rapprochement track with Iran. But from 1987 onwards, that completely disintegrated, with the behaviour of Iran from that period becoming far more aggressive regionally, etc., and many other factors causing concern in the West. So a whole new regime of sanctions starts to be applied, and with each new threat that emerges in Iran, new layers of sanctions get added, and particularly in relation to its nuclear ambitions. So these, have been significant impediments to Iran achieving a very significant economic development. And we'll look at some of the ways they've gotten around that recently through relationships they've built. There was internal dissent challenges, and they've emerged from time to time. But one thing to note about Iran, it's one of the most brutal and rigorous police states, and if not the most, on the planet of the earth. In fact, they'll probably compete with China in that respect, and we'll come back to that when we talk about some human rights issues. So the shaping of their future foreign policy was really built around or driven by their economic difficulties, and how that they could build their strength by getting around those impediments, because through the sanctions they couldn't even maintain and sustain the capacity of their oil refineries and needed a lot of help to do that. And so where did they get it? So now let's talk about how they evolved their reaction to the attitudes of the West and sanctions and their competition with Sunni powers, and their strategy of building their regional influence through a little bit of a Chinese style of creating pressure points, and what those pressure points look like, and what the regime and world of proxy warfare has become based on entirely the Iranian dynamic in the region. So the first component of this capability to create this impact or this effect or generate this effect is the creation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, the IRGC. And it was created in May of 1979, and it was a separate military force to the Iranian army. And its mandate was to look at preventing foreign influence within Iran, but also thwarting coups by the traditional military, crush deviant movements, as they were labelled, that threatened the Islamic Revolution ideology. So really an organisation that's both military security and internal policing. It's like a combination of the Defence Force and ASIO, etc., and all these other agencies here in Australia in some ways. And so their operations were geared in particular to capturing, preserving and building upon the lessons about asymmetric warfare that they learned in the fight against Iraq. And so they really looked at what are their assets, and so that was all based around threats. Threats not necessarily delivered on. Threats are more powerful, of course, if they hang over your head. And once you've shot your bolt in that respect, then you may have lost significant leverage. But in particular, Straits of Hormuz, such a key choke point for the international oil trade, and they built missile sites and these boghammer techniques along the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, I I remember the US war gamed what the effect of that would be, I think in around 2016 or somewhere around then, and worked out that they were going to lose quite a lot of ships in that process, and have since then obviously made a lot of tactical and capability measures to deflect that. And then they started, obviously as part of your ideology and building your leadership in the Islamic world, you start to classify your terrorist and insurgency promotions and your building of organizations that are dependent upon you and can undermine other authorities, governments, regions, and countries through what are called resistance operations. And so you label that too under that banner, so you can appeal to those who opposed the existence of Israel. So they then combined their armed forces with the ground forces of the Navy and Air Force eventually. This is the IRGC, and all aspects of intelligence, and then the special forces. So you see effectively 125,000 personnel in the IRGC as it matured. Then you saw the evolution of other elements that it then controlled, like the Basij militia, which is a volunteer, in inverted commas, based force with about 90,000 regular operators. They call them soldiers, and about 300,000 reservists. And they're really there to really help that iron fist of local control of the population to respond to any evidence of demonstration or dissatisfaction or disobedience to the harsh Islamic laws, particularly for women, etc., but to particularly disrupt and deal with people who seek to demonstrate against the regime. And then they also got into the media and information warfare aspects with setting up their own Separ News. Later on, of course, you would see Iran move into hyperdrive with things like Press TV and Hispan TV. But this was operated by the IRGC. On the 16th of March 2022, it also adopted an independent branch which came to be known as the Command for the Protection and Security of Nuclear Centers. And this was obviously associated with Iran's nuclear ambitions and its program. And of course, at this stage, they knew that there were vulnerabilities in pursuing that objective, that Israel was going to be very active in trying to eliminate their ability to get to that point or delay it as long as possible, hope for regime change, whatever. But certainly they knew that there would be attempts to undermine their ability to get to that result. And so the IRGC was tasked with this new command of protecting their nuclear capability and their process. Really, the IRGC then evolved to insinuate itself on just about every aspect of Iranian politics, economics, energy, food industries, and society. So it's a money-making enterprise in its own right, which has obviously led to many forms of corruption and greed and self-aggrandizement of those involved with the IRGC. So it's a kind of reflective of some other models that we've seen in other countries. And then associated too with this growth of the IRGC is the Quds Force, which has a different role. And so the predecessor of the Quds Force was known as Department 900, and that was created during the Iran-Iraq War as a special intelligence unit initially. But after the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, the IRGC was reorganized, and the Quds Force was established at that time in 1988 as an independent service branch of the IRGC. So the role of the Quds Force was expanded to include supporting non-state actors and terrorist organizations in their target countries. So these included Hezbollah, Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Houthi movement as some of their very principal and prominent mechanisms for conducting acts of aggression against countries in the region. And, there were also Shia militias in Iraq that they could exploit, so the Quds Force would get involved in helping to organize and orchestrate them, and Syria and Afghanistan as well. So, we've seen quite an arc and array of pressure points that were being built through the Quds Force, and also they came to be a mechanism in their own right to be able to deliver terrorist incidents, actions, and outcomes globally, in fact. And what we see over time too is through the IRGC and their proxies like Hezbollah are building of a relationship for illicit revenue gathering. So in the face of the sanctions, there was a very tight relationship built, for example, between Hezbollah and the South American drug lords, a relationship which still continues to this day. So the Quds Force reports directly to the Supreme Leader of Iran, and now it's Ayatollah Khamenei. And in January 2010, the mission of the Quds Force was further expanded, and the force, along with Hezbollah, started a new campaign of attacks targeting not only the US and Israel, but also other Western bodies. So it's organised effectively, the Quds Force, into 8 different directorates. And so you have Western countries, and that includes Turkey in that basket, former Soviet Union, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan group, and then a North Africa and Arabian Peninsula group. So you have also a division evolved between the members, where those who are designated as combatants and those who do the training and oversight of foreign assets. So, and that, in turn is divided into branches focusing on intelligence, finance, foreign languages, politics, sabotage, and special operations. And members are chosen for not only their skills, but also their allegiance, particularly to the doctrine of Islamic revolution. And so the strength of the Quds Force is somewhere between 17 and 20,000. So it's the Quds Force that evolves the sorts of tools that become very useful to these terrorist organizations. One example of those is explosively formed projectiles. So quite simple technology that you can disperse amongst a wide range of your proxies and actors. We first ran into these on a significant scale in Iraq, where we lost hundreds of soldiers, lots of soldiers maimed and killed as a result of these EFPs. At that time, there wasn't a counter to it. Effectively, it involves a charge creating a molten copper core that is projected and just burns its way through almost any sort of form of armor, and very hard to counter. So in addition to adopting or developing simple technologies like that, they also were able to set up their expertise in tunnel warfare networks and develop those extensively with in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then the relationship with North Korea also comes into play here, who are enlisted to help build the extensive tunnel networks in southern Lebanon for Hezbollah, until Hezbollah establishes its own construction company to help deliver that. So there are lots of economic activities by the Quds Force as well. It's really interesting how they, really develop their spectrum of influence, these organisations. But they have many companies that are controlled by the Quds Force that maintain banking relationships with the Bank of Kunlun, a subsidiary of the China National Petroleum Corporation. They have lucrative drug smuggling operations between Afghanistan and Iran. They leverage connections with South American drug cartels. The core budget was leaked in a hack in February 2024, and at that point was said to be $7.7 billion. It trains and equips foreign Islamic revolutionary groups around the Middle East, and the paramilitary instruction provided by the Quds Force typically occurs in Iran or Sudan. It shows you that interconnectivity with other bad faith actors internationally, with how they interfere in places in Africa as well. And foreign recruits are then transported from their home countries to Iran to receive their training. And sometimes the Quds Force also plays a direct role in military operations of the forces it trains, including pre-attack planning and other operations-specific military advice. And so we'll come back in our next episode to talk about some of the examples of that and some of how this has evolved in the region, and the threat and the scale of it that it managed to evolve into in recent times, and then how that has really manifested itself, and the developments of it in the context of the current war in the Middle East. So thanks for being with me for this introduction to the evolution of the current security threat of Iran, and I look forward to now fleshing out with you next week the sophisticated elements of where we sit now with that. So we'll see you again next time. Cheers.